Nothing contained in this videocast is intended to encourage the use of illegal substances. This videocast represents only the opinions of the host and their guests and should not be taken as medical or legal advice. In no way does listening, reading, corresponding, or interacting on social media with our content establish a doctor-patient or legal relationship. The content here is intended to share thoughts and opinions and foster constructive discussion. Please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions concerning cannabis. The views expressed by hosts and guests on this videocast are not necessarily the views of Global Cannabis Times or any other company with which the hosts and guests are associated.
Welcome to another episode of Going Global, a Global Cannabis Times videocast that seeks to act as the eyes and ears on the ground in emerging international cannabis industries. My name is Chris Parrington. I'm a partner in the law firm of Zuber Lawler, based out of our office located in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm joined today by Chris Tholkes, Director of the Office of Medical Cannabis for the Minnesota Department of Health. Ms. Tholkes, how are you today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining me, and thank you for helping us address the current status and current stage of cannabis or marijuana in the state of Minnesota. It's been an extremely exciting time, and I'm looking forward to getting into this. But before we get going, could you do me a favor and just tell me what is the Office of Medical Cannabis and what's your role as its director?
Sure. Thank you. The Office of Medical Cannabis actually is located in our state health department, Minnesota Department of Health, and we are the regulatory office in the state over our legal cannabis industry for the medical program in the state.
And how long have you been in that role?
Sure. So I've been in the role since 2019. And as the lead regulator, I oversee the team of, since it's a medical program, we have a team that's focused on the patients and the healthcare providers. And then we have another team that's really focused with the manufacturing side and cultivation and inspections, compliance enforcement.
Are there any other government agencies in Minnesota that are involved in the regulation of medical marijuana?
No, it's solely our entity, our office, and we do sometimes lean on our sister agencies if they have expertise that we do not. So, for example, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, if there are cultivation questions that we don't know the answer to or we're uncertain of, we can call on our partners over on the agriculture side, as an example.
Okay. And do you have any oversight or regulatory jurisdiction over hemp products or the hemp industry in Minnesota, or is it just medical marijuana?
Just medical marijuana.
Wonderful. And has the Office of Medical Cannabis been around since the launch of the medical marijuana program, or has it evolved as we've seen in other states in terms of regulatory authority and agencies?
Yeah, the office was launched in 2014 when medical cannabis passed in Minnesota. Of course, the program and the office have changed over time.
Can imagine. In what ways, what changes have you seen, or what changes have been significant to the program?
Sure. So we've seen, each legislative session, I think that there has been either some small changes or some more significant changes to the program. Everything from changing the number of dispensaries that are allowed in the state to allowing our manufacturers to be able to purchase hemp from the hemp cultivators in our state. We've also done a variety of things like add additional medical conditions for qualifying conditions for patients. And we've added more forms of medications or delivery methods as well. When the program started out in 2014, it was a fairly restrictive program, especially compared to other programs in the nation. And, we really started out with a very small product line that was primarily concentrated extracted products. So we had pills and capsules, tinctures, those sorts of things. No flower in the program when we launched in 2014. No edibles, nothing like that. Those two products, both flower and edibles, were just added in 2022. So we launched flower in the program on March 1st of this year, and then we added edibles. And again, a more restrictive definition of edibles in the medical program. We allow for gummies or chews in our program, but that's the only form of edibles. And that became available on August 1st of this year.
So if edibles and flower weren't part of the program initially, was the evolution or the addition of those products something that was planned out at the beginning, and it was just a matter of reaching a certain threshold of patients or types of qualifying conditions, or Is this something that changed just as the needs and the demands of the patients and the program changed?
I think it's something that evolved over time. There was a lot of hesitancy when the program first launched in 2014. For folks that were a little unsure of what to expect from a program, they really wanted to keep it tight. It was very intentional not to allow flower. There aren't other medications that are available in combustible form. And so they wanted to just really stick to a very strict medical model and mimic other pharmacological products.
Okay. Do you know what caused the change to adding, for example, flower? Because I know, people that I speak to in the medical industry talk about, how is it that this is a medicine that doctors are prescribing somebody to smoke? That most doctors won't say, go smoke something as part of your medical program or as part of your medical treatment. But what happened that caused Minnesota to add flower to its program?
Sure. So, I think that, obviously, the program has grown tremendously. So we have about 38,000 patients right now. And, when the program passed in 2014, I've seen records that they would be thrilled when the program matured and hit 5,000. So we've obviously greatly exceeded that. I think that the combination of the number of patients and the number of healthcare providers. We have about 2,400 healthcare providers participating in our program that are certifying patients. And Minnesota does a pretty great job about collecting data on patient experience. What are the side effects? What are the benefits? What condition do you have? We've issued a number of reports, condition-specific reports on the benefits and adverse events that people have experienced while in the program. And I think that data has really helped to break down stereotypes or break down stigma in the program. And, with experience, what we've seen is that patients really need a combination of products. So we're not just seeing patients stick to one form of medication. So, for example, most of our patients are certified for pain. That's obviously a very common condition. And for pain, sometimes pretty frequently, patients will take like a capsule or a tablet, which will give them some extended relief. But then they'll also either use a vape or flower if they have breakthrough pain and they need a little bit more. With a capsule, you can't really titrate your dose. But with a vape or flower, you're able to just add a little bit more as you need it. And I think that having that variety of products in the program has been really beneficial.
So it's safe to say in your office, with the data that they're collecting, that the days of, or at least the experiences in other states of a bud tender or an employee at a dispensary providing anecdotal experiences and using that as a way of treating conditions for, this type of a condition or this type of a product. What you're trying to do essentially is take the data and actually have some research and some analytical material to use for that purpose.
That's right. And, Minnesota's program also is a pharmacist-based program. And so as patients come into the program, they aren't meeting with a bud tender, they're meeting with a pharmacist. And that pharmacist is looking at their intake, reviewing their medical history, reviewing what other medications they're on, looking for counterindications, giving them advice on sort of what might work best for their particular situation. The research is still lacking in the cannabis space because of federal restrictions in that area. So there still is quite a bit of trial and error even with a pharmacist. They are giving some recommendations and each individual has to really do what's best for them and maybe try some different products. But you've got that medical knowledge that you're consulting with.
Is that data then shared with the healthcare practitioners so that they can have a better understanding of what they may recommend to patients based on the treatment, based on the, maybe limitations on consumption, those types of things?
So it's available to the certifying provider. So the medical provider that certified them in the program can see pharmacist notes, can see what that patient was picking up. Ideally, we recommend that patients work with their primary physician or physician's assistant. Advanced practice nurses can also certify, but we want them to work within their home healthcare system. Unfortunately, there still is some stigma out there. And so we are finding that sometimes that home healthcare system won't certify a patient and they have to go find someone else. So that does happen. We also have instances of like the folks who receive their care through the VA, the Veterans Administration. That's a federally funded program. Those medical providers are not allowed to certify patients for medical cannabis. So anyone who's receiving care through the VA has to go find a different certifier, unfortunately, at this time. So we see some unique instances, but whoever that certifier is can see the patient record.
Wonderful. It's great to see Minnesota really operating, at least from my observation, from what you just described, as a true medical industry, as opposed to, I think, the stigma and the reputation in other states that it's really an adult use or a recreational industry that's being disguised as a medical industry. Is that kind of a safe way of describing Minnesota versus other states?
Yes, we're very proud of that model in Minnesota. Mm-hmm.
So from the operational side, how many licensed operators do we have in Minnesota today?
Sure. So our statute in Minnesota limits us to 2 vertically integrated entities, which means that we have 2 entities that are doing all of the functions. So they each are cultivators, processors, manufacturers, and they have retail dispensaries. The other restriction is that they are each limited to 1 cultivation facility. And so that does put a little bit of limits on production capacity.
Are there limits on what type of flower they can grow? So what types of genetics, how much they can grow, canopy space? I mean, is it pretty restrictive on those licensees, or do they have some flexibility?
They have some flexibility. We don't have canopy space. We don't have canopy restrictions or anything like that. In Minnesota, we have 2 slightly different models. We have one manufacturer that is entirely indoor grow and is in a suburban area. And so they have a little bit more limitations on their expansion capacity. And then we have another manufacturer that is located in a more rural area, and they are primarily greenhouse grow, and they have many acres that they could expand into if they need to.
And how many dispensaries do those 2 operators have in the state?
Sure. So they can each have 8. Currently,
Okay.
we're operating 14. There's 2 slots that have not yet been opened up.
And how much of the location of those dispensaries is legislated or dictated to those operators? How much flexibility do they have in determining where they are?
Sure. So our office actually is responsible for determining sort of the geography of where where those manufacturers can open their dispensaries. And what we did was look at congressional districts, and we split it out that way. And our rationale for that was really to look at population, to get geographic distribution across the state so that we didn't have them all in the urban or metro area. And then, when we added, I think it was 2019, when we doubled the number of dispensaries, we then flipped where they could have their dispensaries. So originally we said one manufacturer would have congressional districts with odd numbers and one would have even numbers. And then we flipped that so that the consumers would have some variety, because the manufacturers come up with their own product line. And so we wanted the manufacturers to be present in each congressional district.
Wonderful.
So I'm going to ask you a little bit of a loaded question here based upon your role and based upon the previous conversation. Do you think that Minnesota's medical marijuana program has been a success?
I think that it has. I think that we have nearly 40,000 patients now. We've continued to grow over time and adapt. I think there is still room for some improvement, though. We're certainly not a perfect program. I think that one of the biggest struggles for me personally is this is unfortunately because of how marijuana is scheduled federally. There's no insurance coverage. There's no, it's an expensive program. You have to be able to afford to be able to participate in the program, which, as someone who comes from a public health training and background, it really hurts my heart a little bit that there are still access issues to the program. We are seeing people benefit, but it's unfortunate that not everyone can access the program because of the cost.
What, if anything, is the office doing to educate patients on the value, the power of medical marijuana? And specifically, I'll just give you an example. My mother, 3.5 years ago, passed away from a fight with cancer. And after 6 years of going to the hospital for chemo, I tried to convince her to become a medical marijuana patient to help with some of the pain and the nausea. And she would constantly tell me, I don't do drugs. I'm not going to do drugs. As she's hooked up to a chemo pack, every 3 weeks. And it took a lot of work for me to educate her on the value and importance of medical marijuana. And I'm sure that's an issue that we're seeing with patients out there, because there's got to be more than 40,000 people that could use the medicine. Is the office doing anything to help educate patients on medical marijuana use and the value of it?
We do a ton of speaking engagements. We are a small team of 17, but we really try to respond to any of the requests that we have coming in for speaking engagements. And we do everything from conferences, we do patient support groups. I very recently did a brain tumor support group, spoke to a group of patients. A couple of them were already patients in our program, so they shared personal testimonials about how it's helped them. We also do a lot of speaking to healthcare facilities, trying to educate healthcare providers on how they can become a certifier in our program. And we try to connect healthcare providers with one another, because I think they like to hear from their peers in hopes that they will communicate to their patients as well.
Does your office work in collaboration with the two licensees on education programs, so that you're not just hearing it from the agency, but you're also hearing it from the licensed operators, the sources of the medicine, and actually, because it's vertical, the sources from literally from the ground all the way to consumption?
Yeah, we do. We do a variety of things with the manufacturers. Most recently, this spring, we did our first continuing medical education conference with Vireo Health, promoted the event, and our office participated. We were speakers, did some breakout sessions, and it was a great opportunity to meet both patients and providers at that event and share more information as well.
Well, I can tell you, as somebody who represents operators around the country, it is very nice to hear that operators and regulators are working together, as opposed to what you see in other states, which often is regulators and operators fighting against one another. So as a native Minnesotan, it's very good to hear that the collaboration exists, because I think it benefits the industry, the patients, the quality of the medicine, and everything. So that's very exciting to hear.
Yeah, and Minnesota also is unique in that these two operators, these two manufacturers that we have licensed in Minnesota, were both founded by physicians. Yeah. And so there is, I think, a uniqueness to that as well. So they definitely understand and are bought into educating providers.
Now, I'll tell you, if you talk to people outside of Minnesota and you ask them what their opinion is of the Minnesota market, they will tell us that the Minnesota medical marijuana program is extremely conservative, almost too restrictive, because of the qualifying conditions, because of the challenges, because of the number of operators. What are your thoughts in terms of comparing Minnesota's industry to some of these, what I would classify as more liberal industries, where you've got numerous operators almost that look and feel like a recreational market? Do you think what Minnesota's done is better, is worse? Do you have an opinion on that?
I don't know if it's better or worse. I think that it fits for Minnesota. I think that the legislature and the folks that really launched the program were very thoughtful about how they put it together. The intention of the legislature was to mimic the clinical system, and that's how the program was set up. So if you're asking about success in that way, I think it was successful. They asked for a medical model, and that is what we set up. We've kind of morphed over time. It's only been 7 years, but so much has changed in those 7 years. And, this industry is just changing every day. And so we're trying to keep up with that, trying to be true to our commitment to inform the literature with our data, inform federal agencies with what we know about our experience regulating, about our patients' experience, all of those things. And I think that's been good for Minnesota.
Since 2018, when hemp became legalized under the Farm Bill, we saw a huge increase of what I would classify as alternative marijuana products, Delta-8 products, Delta-10 products, HHC products, you name it. Have there been challenges with your office in trying to keep up with the evolution of some of those products and how they may impact the medical marijuana program in Minnesota?
Absolutely. It's a very creative industry. And, when you're dealing with a plant that has over 100 cannabinoids, I hear this all the time, that it's a little bit of whack-a-mole, where if you try to deal with 5 of the cannabinoids, folks will shift and start using other cannabinoids. And so it is really just an ever-changing market. And we are trying really hard to stay on top of things. We are members of a national organization, the Cannabis Regulators Association, or CANRA. And that has been an invaluable space to have discussion in, because it's all of the state regulators come together and share information and share lessons learned. And that has been a great space to be able to ask other states directly what they're seeing, how they're addressing issues, what advice they might have, because there are states that have years more experience than the Minnesota program.
And I'll tell you, my observation of Minnesota's program compared to other states is it's going to have a great long-term effect in addition to the short-term effect. And what I mean by that is we don't have dispensaries on every corner. We don't have horror stories of children getting their hands on product that maybe a parent had access to because they were a patient, or you don't have stories of drug driving or any of those things. And as a result of that, I think, you pointed out that we've been around for 7 years. And yet I think a lot of people don't realize that we've been around for 7 years as an industry. They don't realize where dispensaries are. I mean, there's one dispensary that I've had family members drive by numerous times. They didn't even realize it was there. And so I think what's happened is, tell me if you agree with this, the long-term benefit is people have said, well, it's been 7 years since we've had this medical industry with 40,000 patients, or if you want to, convert it over to kind of a recreational type of a concept, 40,000 customers. And we haven't seen any of these horror stories of somebody eating a brownie or smoking a joint and then, maybe having pre-existing mental health issues and committing crimes or anything like that. And so, would you agree that also has been a nice benefit for it, that being under the radar a little bit has helped the industry create some credibility?
Yeah, I think so. We do require adverse event reporting in our program as well, and we use an organization called Safety Call International. And so we do get reports on a monthly basis about any adverse events, serious adverse events that were reported within our program. And, in the entirety of the program, we've had 8 of those. And
wow,
they've all been hyperemesis syndrome, which is cyclical vomiting, and which is stopped by stopping to use marijuana, and then those symptoms dissipate. And so it's possible that there have been some things that didn't get reported, but from a high level view, it appears that we're not seeing a lot of kind of destructive behavior or adverse events that are happening out in the community.
And I think that's created a very positive public opinion of medical marijuana in Minnesota, in my observation. So I think you've done a phenomenal job with that. And it makes me very proud as a Minnesotan and also somebody operating in this industry. So I want to turn over to the hot topic in Minnesota right now, which is the new legislation, the new legalization of THC edibles. But before I get there, I have one other question I want to ask you about medical marijuana. So the obvious positive effect of medical marijuana in Minnesota is you have patients that are getting medicine that they need for their conditions. But I know there has to be other positive effects on the community, on the state, maybe on areas that I can't even think of from the legalization of medical marijuana and the implementation of the program. What are some of those other positive effects that you have seen or that you've had reported back or you've observed in your role as director from the existence of medical marijuana in Minnesota?
Mm-hmm. I think that it's really launched some dialogue. We've had a number of just community dialogue. We've had a number of instances where obviously when we doubled the number of dispensaries, as a manufacturer goes to open a dispensary in a municipality, there's a community conversation about what is this business? What can we expect? And I think that it has sort of facilitated this discussion about what is medical marijuana and how can it be treated, and how can it benefit the community from a jobs or economic standpoint. The ability for our manufacturers to now be able to purchase hemp from hemp farmers in the Department of Agriculture's program. That is another economic opportunity. So I think that there's sort of been a ripple effect beyond just the benefits to the therapeutic benefit to patients.
Is the program big enough that we're also seeing the benefits of tax revenue, or is it not quite large enough that that's a significant positive impact of the industry yet?
So the medical program, the products are not taxed.
Okay.
So
unlike other states. So unlike other states where you hear conversations about tax revenue and whatnot, that's not something in Minnesota that, at least in the medical side, people can latch onto and say another positive effect.
Yeah, it's been coming up in the adult use conversations, but so far in the medical program, that's not something we're seeing.
That's another unique part of this program, I suppose, correct?
Yeah.
So now let's jump over, because the hot topic in Minnesota is THC edibles and THC beverages and the recent legalization effective July 1. What impact has that had on the medical marijuana program in Minnesota?
Sure. So these are hemp-derived products that you're talking about, and
correct.
And products that are outside of the medical program. We have been looking at our dispensary visit data. We've been looking at our product purchase data, and we have not seen a dip in sales. Our program added the gummies and chews that I mentioned previously as edibles to our program on August 1st, and dispensary visits went up significantly around that time. So our patients appear to be buying our edibles. Of course, that doesn't mean all of the patients. I'm certain there are folks that, if the price is better or it's more convenient for them to get a particular product somewhere else, I'm sure that they are out in the kind of over-the-counter market as well. But so far, we have not seen an impact on dispensary visits or product sales.
Maybe not necessarily an impact on the medical marijuana programs or the operators and sales, but how about from a public health concern? Are you seeing an impact on public health in Minnesota from the sale of those products?
So we're hearing a lot of local concern. I think that folks were unprepared. There wasn't a lot of media coverage around the hearings that were happening on this bill when it was being considered. I think that it became effective in July. That's when the media coverage happened, and that's when localities began to think about what exactly are these products, where can they be sold. And I think that there's no disagreement from legislators or localities or state agencies that there's some work to be done to in the future on getting some more public health guardrails around those particular products.
Does your office have any regulatory oversight over any of those hemp-infused edible and beverage products?
We do not. That said, state agencies, the regulatory authority lies with our Board of Pharmacy, and the Board of Pharmacy has not regulated in the cannabis space before. And so they do have a bit of a learning curve. And so we have been happy to serve as a subject matter expert, to be able to provide some technical assistance on, understanding the labels, understanding the product varieties, talking through how we interpret our laws and whether or not that may or may not be applicable to the laws that they're now overseeing. And the Department of Agriculture has been helpful in that way as well, because they have experience in the hemp space from a cultivation and processing perspective. And so we've all sort of been trying to support our sister state agency in their new regulatory duties.
So safe to say, if I was an operator in the new hemp-infused THC edible or beverage industry in Minnesota, the agencies that I'd probably want to at least be cognizant of is, what is your office doing to regulate medical? Even though it may not be a medical product, it gives kind of a good insight into the regulatory framework. Department of Ag and then the Department of Pharmacy. Those are kind of the three agencies that maybe not have direct oversight, but in some way, shape, or form are involved?
Those three, and I would add a fourth, the Department of Public Safety, their Alcohol and Gambling Enforcement
Okay.
Division, because they oversee exclusive liquor stores and these THC beverages. I think there's still a lot of questions around, sort of what is a serving size, where can they be sold, all of those things.
Interesting. So I've dealt a lot with CBD clients that are operating, again, in the hemp industry, in the hemp space, and navigating through FDA regulations and trying to figure out, there's this misconception that, well, hemp is legal, therefore CBD is legal. And if you really look closely at what the FDA is saying, it's not 100% clear. And more importantly, even if it is clear on the legality side of it, you've got labeling issues, you've got marketing and advertising issues. Is there ever a point where somebody might be selling these hemp-infused edibles as though it's a medical product? Maybe they're making health claims or anything like that. Have you had instances like that where it's been reported to you that this might be an unauthorized medical provider, even though it's not marijuana, it's one of these new hemp-infused products?
We have, and making health claims is a no-no. Those are things that we are working together as state agencies. We actually meet regularly. We have a standing meeting where we come together, and in some of these instances where things are maybe in a little bit of a gray area, or where it appears that there might be overlapping issues, that we can come together and agree who's going to take the lead, what exactly is non-compliant in a particular situation, and who needs to be involved, and come up with a collective decision on how to address it. Thankfully, and I don't know if this is unique to Minnesota, but most of the operators that we are encountering, they want to know clearly what the expectations are of them, and they want to comply. And that's really what our goal is to work with them on compliance education and compliance assistance to get them in compliance with the law.
Can the existing medical operators sell hemp-infused products under Minnesota law?
They cannot.
They cannot. Okay. So obviously it's got to be a little bit chaotic at times figuring out, who's regulating what, who's in charge of oversight. Maybe it's the equivalent of a football game. If you have two quarterbacks, you have no quarterback. And so if you've got three people regulating little parts of it or helping out, I got to believe that framework that we have currently is not sustainable long term. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. I think that in the regulatory space, clarity is key. And so, people need to see a clear path to what are the expectations, where can I go to get answers, who can I talk to if I'm not finding answers. And it's a little bit mucky right now.
Do you have thoughts on the best way of changing that? How can we get from where we are today, where it's very mucky and very unclear, to a much clearer system, whether it's one of the existing agencies, regulates and governs these products? Maybe we backtrack on the legislation and make these products illegal. Maybe we go full blown legalization and roll those products into. Do you have thoughts on how we get out of where we are today?
Yeah. So, it's not really my role in a state agency to say how we could fix something. I do know that legislators are, some very smart legislators are working on some language and talking to stakeholders and considering how to move forward in the next legislative session. I will also say that in the past, right before COVID hit, there were actually two reports that were issued, one from the Department of Agriculture, one from the Department of Health, with some recommendations in the cannabis space. And in both of those reports, one of the recommendations was that really we should consolidate our cannabis regulatory functions into a new office, whether it's called an Office of Cannabis Management or whatever you want to call it, that there should be this new regulatory entity where you can license, you can share inspectors, that you have one philosophy, it's the same plant, similar products, similar actors. Sometimes you can be licensed in multiple things. And so, how do you consolidate that? One, for government efficiency, and also just for simplicity for those that are seeking licenses and wanting to operate in the space.
and I apologize for bouncing around, but have there ever been discussions about adding additional medical licensees in Minnesota? I mean, 2 operators seems like a pretty light load. Is that a discussion? And why have we not, as far as you know, why have we not added those additional licenses?
It's been a discussion. There have been bills that have been introduced over the last couple of years, at least since I've been with the program since 2019. There's been a couple instances where bills were introduced. I think that it's largely a political answer is maybe the barrier, and who's in control of committees and what is the political will at the time.
Unfortunately, a lot of the marijuana industry seems to be driven by politics, not necessarily by the science and the medicine. Has been my observation. So I definitely appreciate that. We're getting close to November. We're getting close to an election cycle, midterm election cycle. As I'm sure your experience has been in this space is similar to mine, which is you're as interested in what's going to happen with ballot initiatives as you are in terms of governors, in terms of Senate seats, in terms of House seats. We have, one neighbor in South Dakota who the voters legalized, but the government didn't necessarily agree with it. We've got another state north of there in North Dakota that, at least everything I'm seeing and hearing, is we might get legalization up there. What impact, if any, do you think legalization in neighboring states will have on Minnesota's both medical marijuana industry and the potential of an adult use industry in Minnesota? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. I think that ultimately it's still going to boil down to political will in Minnesota. I think that you're going to see it. We'll just use North Dakota as an example. As there are many border communities, I think it's going to be an issue for them because having grown up in the Fargo, North Dakota community myself, I know full well that the Moorhead, Minnesota and Fargo, North Dakota operate as one community essentially.
Correct.
And so that state border, although it's illegal for interstate commerce, so it would be illegal for someone to bring it into Minnesota. We know that that's happening in other states where you have legal and non-legal state borders. I think that it's just an issue that folks are going to have to wrestle with. Legislators are going to have to wrestle with. I think that when you are bordering a legal state, folks are at risk for being in possession. And so I think that, we could look to the feds that federal government isn't known for being nimble and fast in coming up with regulations or in this rescheduling consideration that's happening right now under President Biden. But I think that it's all of that is going to be in the mix and inform sort of how people behave. I mean, we know human behavior. People are going to cross the border and they're going to bring it into the state. So I think that, it would be prudent to think about, are they just bringing it across for personal use? Are they bringing it across for resale? And legislators and law enforcement are really going to take all of that into consideration.
I think it's fascinating to watch what the state of Nebraska did when the state of Colorado legalized and their law enforcement efforts and transportation across state lines. There's a lot of fascinating stories and a lot of history there. And I think that, states will get there. I asked the question about Minnesota, though, only because, I think personally think we're very close to legalization as well in Minnesota. So I don't think it's, Nebraska, who is so far on one side, and Colorado, who's so far on the other side of the marijuana spectrum. I think it's a very different position. And I'm curious, do you think legalization in North Dakota will push Minnesota closer to adult use legalization, or do you think we're just still that far away?
It's hard to know. I think that we're closer than we were 2 years ago. Like, I think that I don't think we're 5 years out. I think we're maybe closer than that, but that's just purely my speculation. And, I'm watching all of the polling that's going on with interest. There was a new poll just today that was released by MinPost that shows that there's 60% support. It's across demographics. It's, it starts to lessen a little bit by political party. It starts to lessen a little bit for an older demographic, but it doesn't lessen a lot. And there's just broad, wide sweeping support. And this particular poll asked specifically about the hemp products that became legal on July 1st. And how do folks feel about fully legalizing marijuana in an adult use market? And it was a really interesting poll that the public is there. It's just going to boil down to who's elected and where their priorities are.
Do you think there are things that would need to change at a federal level or even at the state level, other than political issues or political leaders that would push us closer to that? I mean, I always hear about, well, banking's a big hurdle, or intellectual property rights protection, or lack of access to courts, federal courts, bankruptcy courts. Is there anything that you think would help push the state of Minnesota, or maybe just push all states that are currently medical or are nothing and looking at going to medical, push them that step further to another level of legalization?
Yeah, interestingly, I think that federally the banking issue is a big hurdle, and it sounds like there's maybe rumblings of the federal level Congress coming together on that issue potentially in the semi-near future. It hasn't been a huge issue in Minnesota. So I don't know if that would move us. There's just so many considerations for the state around economic development, around interstate commerce, and any of the restrictions that are lifted at the federal level are going to impact those state decisions. So it's just ever-changing space. So it's really fascinating to observe.
Let's just hypothetically say tomorrow we legalized in Minnesota for adult use recreational purposes. What impact do you think that would have on the medical marijuana program in Minnesota? Do you think that would eliminate it? Do you think that would expand it, restrict it? What do you think the impact would be?
Yeah, I don't think it would eliminate it. I know from other states that had a medical program and then later added adult use that many of them saw about a 40% decrease in the number of patients. I also know that a lot of what the feedback that we get from our patients is they really value that relationship they have with the pharmacist. I also think that there's some incentives, right? So like we already talked about, the medical cannabis in Minnesota is not taxed. Legal adult market will be taxing their product. And so there is some incentive for patients to stay in the medical program. I think it's going to vary widely around what each individual need is. Do they want to have this relationship with a pharmacist? Are there products that are meeting their needs in the medical market versus something that they might want to get out on the adult use market? So I think that and the price factor is going to be a big one.
Are there other states that your office or Minnesota looks at as kind of guidance or kind of leaders within the industry for, okay, well, maybe we should consider this expansion, adding this condition to the medical program, or maybe we should consider this way of transitioning from medical to recreational, or regulating alternative products? Are there other states out there that Minnesota looks at and says, that's a good model that we want to kind of work off of?
That's a great question. And I would say that when we're looking at the other states, interestingly, it's more like an a la carte menu. And so we're looking at how, Illinois has done some really interesting things with social equity licenses. Connecticut has some really interesting things they've done around plain packaging and requirements like that with their edible products. So it's more of a looking at particular components and getting a lay of the land through CANRA largely, who has kind of compiled all of that, and then having some conversations about, I think New York is doing this really well. And sometimes you then follow up with that state and they're saying that, if they could do it over, they would fix some components. And so it's really great to be able to sort of sit back and look at the different components and try to put together the best possible package that works for Minnesota, and then also have those conversations with those that are implementing them on the ground to see how smoothly that's actually running for them.
In your experience, is there a lot of collaboration between states on ways of regulating, legislating cannabis, or is it more of every state kind of does it on their own and hopes that they can learn from the lessons? I'm just kind of curious in your experience on how the states work together.
Yeah, there's a ton of collaboration on CANRA has a variety of committees on particular topics. And so those that are interested in laboratory testing and standards, there's a group that meets just on that topic. There's a compliance and enforcement group. There's a seed to sale users group that meets. And so whatever your particular niche is, you can get together with other states and really learn from their experience and share ideas, which is great because another thing that's unique in this industry from a regulator standpoint is that typically as a state agency, we would look to a federal agency for guidelines or best practices. And because of the Schedule I standing, that just isn't happening for cannabis programs at the state level. And so really we're looking to one another as state regulators for best practices or emerging best practices, and trying to learn from those that have gone before us.
You mentioned something earlier about social equity, and I do want to ask a quick question on this. So a lot of states, less in medical, more in adult use, seem to really focus on social equity as being a big part of their programs, big component of the application process. And every state has a different way of looking at it. Some states like Florida will earmark licenses for social equity candidates. Some states will focus not on license ownership, but they'll focus on employment training. You mentioned New York's created a fund to be able to provide some financing support for social equity applicants or social equity candidates. Minnesota doesn't really have social equity in its current medical cannabis program. Do you see that changing? Have there been discussions about changing, or do you think that's maybe something that we see more at the adult use level once we get to legalization?
Yeah, I think that unless something changes in the medical program where we have the ability to add additional licenses, we probably won't see it in the medical side of things, just for exactly that reason, because we're sort of locked into these two licensees. We're not rebidding them at this time. We don't have additional license opportunities. But I am watching closely what other states are doing, because I think that our country has this history of how the drug laws have vastly impacted communities differently. And there are groups of Black and Brown Americans that were, if you look at white and Black Minnesotans, they use marijuana at the same rate. But those that are charged and incarcerated around drug offenses are largely Black Minnesotans. And so giving folks some opportunity, those that have been disproportionately impacted for many, many years, opportunity in the industry, and not just opportunity like low-level opportunity, but full opportunity. And you're dealing with communities that have historically not had access to capital and all sorts of things. And so I just really feel strongly that I hope that our legislators and thought leaders are having some sincere conversations within the communities, because I suspect that they have some great ideas of their own on how this could be addressed in a good way in Minnesota.
And I agree completely. I mean, social equity is a way that you can use this industry to right past historical wrongs and also provide unbelievable opportunities for people. So no, I 100% agree with you that I hope that as we continue to grow, whether it's expansion of the medical program or legalization in Minnesota, that social equity becomes a very important component in that. So no, we are 100% on the same page. From a private sector person and a public sector person, we see eye to eye on that. So last question for you, and this is going to bring it back to if anybody was questioning what part of the country we live in, I'm going to ask you this question. Hockey is heavily influenced by Canada. Minnesota, Canada, those are the hockey hubs. Canada is also a huge cannabis nation. With their federal legalization, you have the Canadian access to the Canadian markets to raise capital. Has Canada had any influence on the medical marijuana program in Minnesota that you know of?
I don't know that they've had a direct impact on the Minnesota program, but I will say that the Canadians are very active in Canada, and that it's sort of a North American association, and so they do come to events. They share updates, and it's really fascinating to learn what they've done around marketing, what the different provinces have done, and just to really see where they're going. And some of it is applicable, but then there's other things that are happening that I'm like, oh yeah, they don't have that pesky First Amendment. So they have different approaches that they can take. And so our neighbors to the north are very helpful, very collaborative, and we welcome them into the space as well.
Has your office seen any problems with a Canadian product coming across the border into Minnesota and maybe serving as an alternative or a competitor with Minnesota's medical marijuana program?
Not that I know of. I
Not that
just
you know of.
am not aware of any of that.
Wonderful. Well, Chris, I want to thank you for your time in providing this wonderful insight into the past, present, and future of marijuana in Minnesota. It really, truly is an exciting time right now, and we're very lucky to have leadership like you overseeing our medical marijuana program. And I'm confident that you'll continue to be involved and be a resource as we try to regulate the THC or hemp-infused THC edible and beverage program, and as we get closer and closer to legalization. So I want to thank you for your time and thank you for your insight. And I want to thank everybody else who joined us today for this video cast. And don't forget, if you want to subscribe to our magazine, you can do so by going to globalcannabistimes.com. Thank you.